Hello, everybody. So this is a synchronous discussion on the static site editor for the static site editor group, and specifically the editor that we use in our product feature. The editor is called Toast UI Editor. It was the editor that we decided to go with when we had a blank canvas in front of us. At that point in time, it really seemed to meet the expectation we had of where we wanted to take the product. It looked robust, it met all our criteria, and so we decided to move along with that. However, as our product vision has evolved and we've received user feedback, we've become more in tune with what our users need and where we want to take our product going forward, as well as getting a better understanding of the technologies used by Toast UI Editor. It's the underlying projects that it uses, and the need of what we want to achieve with our editor. It essentially come to a point where we want to have a discussion to determine whether is Toast UI Editor the right tool for us for the long term. We've made some significant investment in writing, I don't want to say custom code for it, but code using the APIs that it provides already. It's not features that it comes with out of the box, but so we've extended the functionality through public APIs that it has. However, there is also things we want to do and behavior that it has that we want to bypass or provide alternative behavior that they don't have public APIs for right now, and we can achieve it, but in a hacky way, and we don't particularly want to do that if we don't have to. However, all of this said, the purpose of the discussion that we're starting today and that we'll conclude in the issue is to get to the point where we want to make a determination whether we commit to Toast UI Editor for the long term. I'm not talking about the next 2 or 3 milestones. I'm talking more 6, 12 months down the line. Do we still want to be building on top of Toast UI? And in the short term, it's there and we'll use it. We're not going to pause what our development efforts right now and kind of like switch everything. If we do, I would imagine if we do decide to move to a different editor or a different strategy, we would do it behind a feature flag in parallel, while trying to achieve our main near-term objective, which is integration with the handbook and allowing an easier editing experience of that. But we need to start making this decision now and start understanding the impact of the decision that we make, so that we can factor that into our roadmap going forward. So that's a brief kind of like recap of why we're meeting and the expectation of what the outcome of the discussion needs to be. We don't have to discuss if we end up on the decision of yes, we want to explore, we should be exploring a different editor. The objective is not to identify which editor yet. It's merely a decision of, is Toast UI the right tool to build our static site editor product on top of for the next 6 to 12 months? With that, Eric gave a quick overview of the product direction that he's been exploring for our static site editor. And that gives valid input into this discussion as well. We can't negate where we want to go 6, 12 months down the line and exclude that from this decision. It really has to be part. So I'm going to hand over to Eric and ask him, Eric, you don't have to obviously in detail kind of like go through everything, but just a top level summary of kind of like what you discussed in yesterday's group calls, the videos of which are available, and team members can catch up on that as well. So over to you, Eric.
Thanks. Yeah. So let me post a link to the image I shared in the design group call. But I think as far as medium to long-term vision, what we're talking about here is wanting to provide an editing experience that is as fully functional in the WYSIWYG mode as possible, in that we are, I'm I'm not convinced by our initial research that a split view, live preview, code slash like rendered HTML version of the Markdown is going to solve our users' needs. I think the editing experience, if I can just use some other products as examples, the editing experience of something like Dropbox Paper or Notion or even Google Docs is more familiar and more intuitive for our users, and the type of content that we're hoping to target with these changes is a lot more editorial, longer form, or at least structured by nature. So the ideal path in my mind right now would be that we have a fully featured WYSIWYG editor that provides real-time feedback of Markdown formatting, but doesn't require you to know Markdown syntax. If you do know, per Chad's comment in the issue, if you do know Markdown syntax, I'm hopeful that we can have formatting shortcuts so that you can actually type in Markdown and it would render on the fly. We definitely want to keep that in mind. And I think really the goal would be to somewhat I don't want to say hide the underlying Markdown, but make it unnecessary that you would even need to switch to a code editor. And then I would add to this, if we do need to switch to a code editor, I think strategically it makes a lot more sense for us to align around the code editors we already have in the app. So considering using Editor Lite or sending people to the Web IDE. So I shared this little walkthrough here. Just say image.
And while Eric puts that down, it might be worth just quickly recapping the three fundamentals that we're basing our product vision on. The first one is the user should not need to understand Markdown syntax to be able to contribute. The user should not need to understand Git workflows to be able to contribute. And the third one is the user should not have to set up a website locally to contribute and then have to go into the terminal to contribute. So those are the kind of like three kind of like things that underpin our kind of like product strategy at this early stage.
Yeah, and ultimately what we're looking for is an experience as close to writing in a document as you can get. So imagine someone who is completely unfamiliar with the template layout of a static site and has just been tasked to create a page. We could provide a longer term. We've talked about providing something like a block editor or something like that, where you can insert elements that are from a preset list of supported types, and we can almost build a page like that within the editor. I think that's something to keep in mind long term as we discuss whether Toast UI is the one that we want to hitch our wagon to. But
can I make a comment on the comment I made about being able to edit the raw Markdown? So I saw just now the comment that you made, Jean, and linked to the shorthand, what we're calling it, like if you type some Markdown, it'll automatically get turned into something in the WYSIWYG editor. And I don't want to derail this conversation, and I know that's not this meeting, but I still remain skeptical that could work. Like one example I think of is a code block. I type 3 ticks and then enter, and I start typing something, and that turns into maybe a code block, and I'm typing code. That's all fine. But say, oh, I want this to be Ruby, actually, I would want to go back and type Ruby or SH or YAML after those 3 ticks. It's how do I do that? Do I have to right click? Like I have to know something. Whereas if I just know Markdown, all I have to do is go to the raw Markdown and type Ruby there. So situations like that, the convert on the fly approach, I'm still skeptical that that would meet, the persona that I am, that I want control over the raw Markdown and I don't want to have to figure out how to get back to it.
Totally fair point. And I think the challenge there is that I don't think an experience where you're flipping back and forth is what we should be building towards. Like, I think if anything, what I would say is we would continue to provide the side-by-side until we can build a UX that allows you to choose the language or insert the language in a code block from the visual editor. That's a good edge case that probably would take us a long time to solve. But until we can provide that kind of UX, we would probably continue to provide access to the raw Markdown. I think aspirationally, though, we should try and be able to do everything, including that, within the visual editor.
Obviously,
Okay.
this all needs validation, but one thing to kind of think about too is, and I have a response kind of mock with some of them Michael's working on, but basically when you launch in, the call to action to actually work on a particular file, it's basically, do you want to edit it? Like, are you going to kind of contribute more in the code space or more in the content space? And just however that's framed, that can be the driving path to, you're now in the Monaco editor or the web ID or whatever that's more, code ready, versus someone who just wants to contribute content, which again is our focus, hence the WYSIWYG. And what Eric was just referring to is maybe less the needing to go back and forth. We still could, it just might take another 500 milliseconds because you're actually going to link out to the other editor or something like that. And obviously even further downstream, if that needed to be integrated, we could still do that. So I think there's possibilities all around. So I just wanted to share that, I guess.
The other thing, just to off the top of my head, if we go down the path of having a block editor kind of concept where there's distinct blocks of content and each element, each HTML element or Markdown element is its own thing, we could potentially validate whether we could expose just the Markdown for a block, like flip just a block to show the raw source and then flip it back, rather than changing the whole editor back and forth. So if you need to tweak the source, or if you just want to ensure that it's writing it in the way that you want, you could do that. Just an idea.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, Chad. I'm going to be the time cop and say I would like to pause on this situation. I think you have a valid concern.
Can I make a different point? It's not really about that. It's about our requirements in general.
Okay.
So
that's fine.
I think there's benefit to be had from the static site editor experience, aside from the fact of it being a WYSIWYG. I'm just concerned about us being like, that's the overwhelming, or like the most important feature of it. But I think there's a lot of benefit of, I can edit it in page in the website. I don't have to clone the repo. It has an integrated merge request workflow. It lets me preview my Markdown. Like, those are really valuable to a set of personas that wouldn't necessarily care that much about a WYSIWYG other than just, did I make a typo? I guess that's the point I wanted to make.
It's totally valid. And right now, I think we should move on. But I say that we should aspire to not having the code view, but that's not validated with users. And it's very aspirational in that I want someone to be able to do anything they can do in code in the visual editor, but that might mean that we still continue to offer the raw source.
Cool. Thanks for listening.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, do you have anything further to add on the product vision before we move on?
No, I think that about covers it.
Okay. All right. Derek and Enrique, the two of you have been, I would say, have gone down the rabbit hole the deepest in terms of the internal workings of Toast UI editor and the underlying editing projects that it uses. Can you maybe just summarize for us challenges that we are currently experiencing that you feel might become hurdles for a long-term adoption of the project? Enrique, since you started with your notes first in the doc, I'll let you go first.
Sure. So as Erika described before, we have high aspirations and a big ambition about how much you can achieve with the WYSIWYG node. And to achieve that, we need maximum flexibility in what the tool that we use to build that experience allows us to do. For example, if we want to make that switch from the code editor to a more raw experience within a code block, right now those UI doesn't provide that kind of flexibility. Those UI is some sort of black box that has a big advantage of making you productive immediately, because it is a solution that is already created and allows you to synchronize between WYSIWYG and a code editor. But when you try to jump into tasks like trying to extend the Markdown syntax, or trying to take WYSIWYG editing experience that you are trying to edit rich content and then converting that back to Markdown, it becomes very difficult, because they either do not provide the required APIs to extend the editor in that way, or the APIs that they provide are not enough to the kind of customization that we need.
Cool. Derek?
Sure. Yeah, basically the first thing that comes to mind at a high level is basically we're running into these concerns mostly because we're supporting existing Markdown files that have GitLab flavored Markdown, right? So what that essentially means, and I talk about this in my first bullet point, is GitHub flavored Markdown, GFM, is what it leverages, but GitLab's version of that is an extension of that. What that means is we have a bunch of other syntax right now that we're creating custom renderers for. So that's kind of where this added complexity is, that we're trying to Enrique's point, we're leveraging Toast UI that gives us a lot out of the box, but then now when we're using it in the context of a lot of our existing files and .erb.md files, for example, right? That's where we're running into this issue. So I just kind of want to throw that at a high level. That's kind of where this is kind of coming from. So whether that can be solved through formatting all those files, right? That's something we're actually in process of doing. That's help alleviating some of that. But anyway, I just want to throw that at a high level. So yeah, I guess a few of my bullet points basically are Markdown flavor support. I just kind of hit on that a little bit with respect to ours as an extension of what they already support. The cursor changing position is definitely something we've had an issue open for example, and the APIs are very limited there. So that's something that we've run into. Code mirror baggage, I kind of comment there in the doc. And then kind of the fourth one that would be really nice is vModel support out of the box. This is something I think we kind of have assumed happens. And this is just something that for people in the Vue world are just kind of expecting. And for performance reasons, I think essentially, as you can see linked, I have it linked in the doc, that wasn't pursued basically, but it's something being considered. And so those are kind of the cons. I also want to say, obviously Enrique mentioned that it's kind of hack right now, our implementation, but there, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Enrique, there is an MR there. So there's some positives to be said here as well, right? Like and so I can kind of hit on those there in the pros, like the maintainers have been pretty responsive. And I think what I'm referring to there, Enrique, on your point 3 is I think they have an MR for that. I think you shared that. So that's kind of, another nice bonus. Personally, in working with the custom renderers, and I know Enrique's seen some of this through reviews and probably working on it a little bit too, is the Toastmark AST thought that they put into that is really valuable. Again, maybe that's choosing another solution that goes away, but that has been really nice, because I don't think, what I'm trying to say here is we're not going to get out of needing these custom renders, I don't think, because GitLab's flavored Markdown is, again, an extension of GitHub's flavored Markdown, which has a bunch of other custom syntaxes. So I don't think that's, I could be wrong, but I don't think we're going to get out of having to handle those in some way. So whatever our solution, if we do switch solutions, needs to account for that, I guess, is really what that comes down to. And then the last point I already mentioned, I think so far there have been very responsive maintainers, so it's been kind of a plus too.
Yeah. So I want to, and I put this in the issue description, like, I'm not bashing Toast UI Editor at all. I think it's a great solution. I think it's it fills a need in the market very eloquently and effectively, and all the pros you've listed there, Derek, I fully agree with. My concern is that our use case is deviating from the default experience that Toast UI Editor is providing, and as such, we'll always be fighting the default behavior or use case that they're trying to solve by customizing it. And so my question to, and I had a brief discussion with Enrique about this yesterday, is, does it make sense to have, like, because the way I see it is Toast UI Editor is essentially a wrapper over Squire and CodeMirror, and on top of that, it provides a whole bunch of added goodies. But we're essentially pulling away that goodies layer a lot of the time to peek behind what's going on to customize things. And we've seen it with the image upload dialog. We implemented our own. We didn't use the one that came with the. We've seen it now with the source code Markdown editing. We're customizing that because we don't want it to behave in the default way that it behaves in the editor. So we seem to be diverging a lot from the default value you get from Toast UI Editor, from a user experience and the use case that it provides, and morphing it into what we need it to be. And so my question is, does it not make sense for us to develop our own wrapper over some editor, whether it's Squire or whatever, or editor.js that we looked into previously? And to your point, I fully agree. We're going to have to write custom renderers. We want to do things like Mermaid, kind of like diagrams, previewing inline, and WYSIWYG editor. And we want to create a rich editor experience. And so we'll probably keep on doing custom things on top of standard Markdown. I think the other thing to recognize here is that Toast UI Editor is built to work with the common Mark spec, which is call it the default Markdown kind of like syntax spec. And so we're throwing at it a lot more than what its default use case is. And this is the crux of my question, and the reason for this discussion is, does what it provide out of the box? And for instance, and I'm glad you mentioned the Toastmark AST, because I remember you referenced that article they wrote about it, and they did a lot of interesting work there. Does things like that, for instance, make it worthwhile sticking with Toast UI Editor and peeling the layers away from it that we don't need to morph it into what we have, versus going more low level and using Squire, for instance, directly, and creating our own wrapper around that to provide the UI user experience that we want, rather than fighting the Toast UI experience? Because here's my concern: we keep customizing it, and we're doing it in the right way by using public APIs. But every time they potentially change something, we might need to counter change that to match our desired behavior. So our upgrade path as they go along might diverge. And so it's the same we saw initially. We thought it might, when we originally thought about what static site editor might be, it might be in the web IDE. And then we realized as we got into it, our intentions are diverging. And so we decided to go separate. Now, originally, Toast UI Editor made perfect sense for what we thought we needed. But as we started talking to users, the side-by-side preview of Markdown became much less of an important factor than rather just knowing what the Markdown is actually going to become, like the headings and the actual syntax, how that renders on the page. And so the WYSIWYG editor, and then we also heard that for instance, just knowing which page, where the pages to edit was even more important than even the syntax. People were willing to fight with the syntax as long as they could find the page they needed to edit. So as we started getting feedback and talking to our users, our needs evolved. And so my concern is, as we iterate on our product and we keep evolving our product vision, and we're going down this aspirational road of providing a really great user experience from a WYSIWYG editor point of view, is Toast UI going to become a hurdle, a hindrance, or a savior for us in terms of what we want to achieve? And my non-technical estimation here is that it feels like it's going to become a hindrance, in that we're going to have to peel away too much of it to do what it wants to. But that is why I really need your almost like counter arguments to say, no, look at Toastmark ASD. We still need that. It's too costly, for instance, for us to develop that ourselves and maintain that, for instance. These are the factors that I really want us to consider. Is let's make an assumption, or if there's no strong opposition to me saying that I think that it's going to become a hindrance, and let's assume that we need to go down, move away from it. Let's talk then about what would it take for us to bring the nuts and bolts that Toast UI Editor brings, that makes it easy, for instance, to insert a custom renderer, to do the things like Jacques researched on the shorthand, where you can type the Markdown syntax and converts it for you. So those are all kind of like niceties that we want. And if taking those things, if taking Toast UI Editor out of the picture takes those things away, and it requires us 6 months to rewrite that, then like that kind of like makes the cost benefit analysis different again. So I guess my request from you is, what counter arguments can we have to say we should stick with Toast UI Editor, even considering contributing upstream, if that's the way we go? Like, that is not out of the question. We can and should do that if it makes sense. But what are the arguments for sticking with Toast UI Editor rather than going straight to what it uses under the hood and writing our own wrapper around that?
By the way, I don't have anything to contribute to that question, but I still have some ideas that I want to share.
Go for it.
So something that is worth highlighting is that we are trying to customize. We're trying to customize at different levels. For example, we're trying to provide a customization at the WYSIWYG level, because we are trying to build tools to create different sorts of rich content. We are not only trying to build a tool that allows us to render different type of rich content. We also want to find ways of generating that content. And that's a place where I see a limitation in Toast UI, not because of Toast UI, but because of Squire, that it was not designed for that type of use case. Squire was designed as an email editing experience that doesn't require such a powerful tooling. And that's something that Editor.js is a better fit for. Another point is that Toast UI created a Markdown renderer and parser that is called to Mark. But who is the only maintainer of Toastmark? It's Toast UI. It's only the Toast UI maintainers. But there are platforms that are very open, and that word is very important. The word platform. There are platforms that are created to support different type of abstract syntax trees, and to create tools that makes easier to extend parsers. I'm talking about Unified. That is also a platform that I reference in the issue about replacing the Toast UI code editor. So I don't think that if we end up replacing Toast UI, we will replace it with a tool that provides us the features that we want. We have to aspire to have let's say a tool that becomes a platform and allows you like, okay, maybe we have support, a lot of support from the community that is creating a lot of plugins for that platform, and we can just reuse them. And we can benefit from that active community that Toast UI doesn't have either. Maybe Toast UI have a community that, that has many people using the tool, but I don't see a lot of contributions from the outside because the tool was not designed to have that kind of community and contributions. So I think that's where we should go. Like, how can we allow to have many doors open so we can, you know, play with options, as much of options as we want, but at the same time, how we can take advantage of a community that is creating many things that probably we want. So it's like having that balance. Okay, we need like to be productive and have a lot of different things, but we have to keep as many doors open as possible.
I think that's an important point too, by the way, with the platform. And I was thinking about this with just the work we have to do to get the GitLab flavored Markdown in there, the custom renderers that we're building. And I think we need to just call out that we're building this not just for the handbook. I know the point's been made before, but I think we need to remember that our users are on any number of different static site generators. Their preference might be for any number of flavors of Markdown, whether it's Cramdown or Common Mark or GitHub flavor Markdown or whatever. We shouldn't assume that we're going to build on our small team support for all of those. So having a platform that's extensible enough and a feature that's extensible enough so they can plug in their own renderer, either contributing it back to the product or maybe even linking out to it or something like that. Somehow choosing a custom renderer or defining custom rules would be another aspirational long-term goal for us, but something that we should keep in mind when we're evaluating tools when it comes to their support for custom renderers.
I just want to say, so I think it's a no-brainer not to entertain the idea of using something else, right? They're like, that's kind of like a given. So, and I don't want this to be kind of a sunk cost fallacy kind of thing coming from my end, but there is a lot that we're getting out of the box. We run into some kinks, right? That's why we're having this conversation, which is totally necessary and required and is good. My only concern is that, yeah, we try something new. And again, we still need to research something, and maybe it's there and we find it and then boom, like problem solved. But the amount of work that's gone into Toast UI, how much of that are we gonna have to redo? There's that balance to think about. And then to Enrique's point, if there is a platform that we can already leverage, then that work is already done potentially. So it's just a matter of, there's always gonna be a level of customization. I guess if we can, now that we've learned more, we can maybe, Enrique and I could sit down and maybe think through this more deeply or something in terms of like, what do we really need now that we, now that we've gone through this experience or something that might help. Because obviously we're not going to switch right away right now anyway, even if we could, it would take time. But yeah, we definitely need to look for, is there something better? We went down this path because it was the best choice at the time, given the information we had. So that's kind of where we're at. But I agree with Enrique. We can, if there's a better solution that's more, has a larger community and that whole a platform ecosystem, et cetera, like then naturally everybody wins. That's the whole advantage of having a system like that. So yeah, totally worth looking into, 100%.
So for me, both Enrique and Eric, I'm going to take what you've said, and for me, the way I would like to summarize it now is that I think we need to do some definition work around the editing, more from the editing experience we want to achieve, not necessarily just from a user experience point of view, but from a technical point of view as well. I think when we initially validated editors out there, I came up with a bunch of requirements or criteria we should look at, and that was based purely on assumptions. because we had a blank canvas in front of us, and we needed to start somewhere. But now that we've started using it and we've got some product vision going and we've got some user feedback going, I feel like we need to revisit what is the criteria that we are looking for, and the functionality we want to achieve in our editing experience. Not to match with what we have today, but to look 6-12 months down the line in terms of what is that aspirational editing experience we want to create. And it feels like we have a job to be done in defining that, both from a user experience and a technical architecture point of view. And then following that up with a research effort to see what platforms are out there, what tools, you know, is it Editor.js, is it unified? You know, what are the things out there that could potentially speak to this? And we'll probably never find 100% match for our needs and desires, but we can find something that speaks to our, let's say, our non-negotiable criteria that we have for that we define, and the rest we can always work towards, whether it's it having the ability to be extended and we write our own extensions for it, or the ability or the openness to receiving community contributions and changing architecture if that's what it needs to take. But it feels like there's a 3-step process needed here. There's a definition step, there's a research step, and then there's a development step potentially around creating this thing that can essentially replace what we have right now with Toast UI Editor. My concern with that is the longer the 3-step stage takes, the more the further along we go with customizing and building features based on Toast UI Editor. Now, I know based on the MRs we've done, we have been purposeful to have as loose as possible a coupling with Toast UI Editor in our code, and so that in itself makes me you know, optimistic about the path forward. But the fact is that there is some glue between Toast UI and what we're doing, and there will continue to be some glue to achieve what we want. So I think what it really comes down to is timing around what comes next after we achieve our short-term goals. Our short-term objective is integration of the handbook and editing experience and rightly so. I think, Chad, you mentioned, you know, we shouldn't get stuck on just the WYSIWYG editor. It's a part of the static site editor experience. You know, a big part is the actual flow of creating the MR and so on. And so I think what we really just need to take into consideration is being clever with what we prioritize over the next few milestones while we do this research and the definition and research, and not lose focus on doing the definition and research. It needs to be high priority at the same time, so that if we do need to start making a switch, you know, or working towards making a switch, that we don't forget about taking into consideration the cost of carrying on fully, integrating more features into what we have, and having to kind of like undo that or redo that down the line. So I guess first question is, do you agree with the 3-step kind of like next steps: definition, research, and development? Okay, I see a thumbs up.
Yes.
I think we can also make the assumption from the conversation that while we shouldn't discard Toast UI Editor just yet, because we should evaluate it based on our new definition that we define, it is likely that it will not be the long-term solution for us. I'm not discarding it yet, and we have to look at our definition and reevaluate it against that definition. But based on the initial discussion, it's likely that it won't be the future editor for us. With that in mind, we just need to be even more cognizant of how much glue we write between editors. And I guess I'm saying it just as a reminder, reiterating that we should keep this as loosely coupled as possible, which I know you're already doing. So that I think is and then the job that Eric and I would need to do is to figure out how this fits into our roadmap, where we want to. We already know what 13.3 is going to bring, more or less, and but looking at 13.4, 13.5, how we do. Maybe we can pivot to work on some of the user experience beyond just the initial WYSIWYG editing experience. Once we have the minimum criteria met for the handbook editing, you know, the MR creation process and approvals and stuff like that. So that's the only kind of like considerations I think we have as well.
I just want to mention too, I know we all know this, but I just want to throw it out there again, is kind of the main goal right now, right, is to get something in the handbook where we can actually get a lot of users. So we're going to learn a lot there, right? So a lot of the concerns we might have right now might be backed up and more validated, or some of them might just go out the window. So I think that's something to kind of think about too. I guess the other thing I'd add to that is, yeah, like Eric, obviously, and Michael, and like whatever the long-term vision is, like if we know, that's why we don't work that way here, in the sense of like, we work incrementally. It's good to have the long-term vision, but we don't know 100% if that's going to be it. Like, for example, if today we decided to do the block editor and long-term vision, and then that isn't actually what we needed or the users wanted, then, you know, we kind of, so anyway, you already know this, but I just, getting that feedback is going to be huge for us. So that's the main reason why we are where we are. So we can, this is kind of the quickest way we could get there, where we could get something in the handbook. Anyway, I'm kind of repeating myself now. But.
So I think this really addresses kind of like next steps on the WYSIWYG editor side. I quickly want to pivot and talk about the Markdown editing side of things, specifically towards the issue that you opened, Derek, around the kind of like styling overrides we're doing right now on Toast UI editor to get it to look like the source code editor, and the conversation we had with the likes of Dennis and Kai on the issue around using editor light potentially. Is that something we want to give consideration in the near term, regardless of what our determination or our definition and research might throw up over the next month or so? Do we want to stick with what we have, just considering where we're going, or do we want to? Is there value? Is there enough value in saying, let's use the editor light for the source code editing?
My gut is to, again, like, get validation on what we have is kind of how I'm thinking. I think long term, mid to long term, whatever that time frame is, to eventually, with whatever, even if we weren't using Toast UI and we were using something else under the hood, and this is just because I learned this last week, that they're now trying to remove the ACE editor, because I otherwise recommended it, thinking that I was, you know, pushing it towards more convergence when that wasn't in fact the case. So that's, again, what you're essentially alluding to, is we basically stopped at just changing the font size in the Markdown to match. And if we wanted to override some styles, it's ultimately not a big deal, and that's something you can undo pretty easily, frankly. But again, the idea was we can get that for free if we were to leverage Monaco, and again, the maintenance burden related to that. So that's where it gets deeper. But really, if like it was vital to have matching syntax, colors, highlighting, and that kind of thing, like we could do that overriding the CSS, and it would be in one location most likely. So it wouldn't be like, you know, easy to pull out basically if we needed to. So from that specific portion, I don't see it that big of a deal. But
so what I'm reading in your answer is, this doesn't necessarily have to be done right now as part of our short-term objective of successful integration of the handbook. And Eric, you might want to back this up. In my assumption is that WYSIWYG editing mode will be more important than Markdown editing mode for our initial just integration with the handbook and validation testing from users.
Yeah, I think that it's an accurate statement. I think we should move towards a plan to use something like the Monaco Light editor as our source view, but it's not vital to getting feedback at this stage. And if style consistency is all we get, it doesn't seem like the right time to invest in building a custom, bridge between the two.
What is the status of Monaco and support for mobile? Like, I remember hearing that it didn't support mobile or responsive well. Is that no longer a case? Because I know when I was working on the Web IDE, I heard people say that.
I believe it's still the case, but I would argue that, and again, this is just an opinion, I would argue that the WYSIWYG editing experience would be more important to ensure that works on mobile than the source editing experience. That's just the way I read kind of like our user needs. But again, it's just an assumption on my side.
And I've talked to Kai about this, and mobile support in the Web IDE is like less than ideal, but it's not completely broken, we'll say. And a lot of it has to do with just the overall, structure and the amount of information the Web IDE needs to have. But the actual editor itself is functional. I would guess at this point there's functionality that's not available, just because of the way the keyboard interacts with it, and maybe right clicking and stuff like that not being available. But it's not entirely broken, as the issue on GitHub seemed to imply.
All right. Before we wrap up, any parting thoughts? I will summarize the kind of like key takeouts of let me summarize the key takeouts here that I will put in the issue to formalize it. We are not going to, in the short term, and when I say short term, next 1 to 3 milestones, switch out the Markdown editor with Editor Lite. That does not mean we won't do it in the future. We're also not going to stop working with Toast UI Editor in terms of potentially contributing back, keep integrating with it, but we're going to do it in a sensible way that is as loosely coupled as possible, so that if we move away from it, our code impact is minimalized. I will open an epic that describes our intention to revalidate the ideal editor platform to build our product on, and it will have 2 issues. The first issue will be a definition of what the user experience as well as the technical requirements are from the editor, and then the second issue will be to do research on the potential editor options. Does anybody want to add anything to that summary?
I could say that rather than evaluating potential editor options, it will be evaluating the possible combination of tools that we will need. Because if
Yes.
we remove Tools UI, we will have to find a parser, a Markdown parser of that.
Yes, I think in terms of researching alternatives, it would be, what is this collection of tooling that we'd need to achieve what we want to achieve? I don't think, like, Toast UI Editor is by far what I saw the most complete standard Markdown editor out there from a WYSIWYG and source and preview point of view. It's great. I'll reiterate it. I think it's a great editor for a specific use case. I just don't think long-term our use case is aligned with what we get out of the box with Toast UI Editor, and this is what we'll validate through our definition and research. Cool. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your input. I appreciate it, and I will summarize our findings or our conclusions in the issue. I'll close it, and then I'll open the epic for the definition and research. Have a good day further. Bye-bye.
Thank you.